Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first Gender Equity Summit sponsored by the National Postdoctoral Association, or NPA. I'm Tom Kimbus. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the NPA, and we are the national voice of the postdoctoral community. Today, more than 70,000 postdocs across the country are providing innovation, creativity, and leadership in some of our most difficult problems across all disciplines. And the new NPA strategic plan we released this spring highlights diversity, equity, inclusion as one of our 4 core pillars, which we want to dedicate our efforts. We therefore launched this summit in light of this new plan, both to advance the conversations, such as we're having today, around gender inequities, but also to make sure that we push forward positive actions to improve the postdoctoral environment and beyond. The summit is intended to cover all gender equities, so even if a speaker is focusing on issues affecting one particular identity, the lessons are intended to provide to apply broadly. And the same is true in terms of disciplines. So there's a lesson coming out of, say, the life sciences. It is intended to benefit our entire audience base. I want to thank our summit partners before we get started, the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, the Association for Women in Science, AWIS, the Higher Education Recruitment Consortium, or HERC, and of course today, our core sponsor for this panel, Out to Innovate. The summit has consisted of 5 sessions. This is the final one. If you haven't had a chance to tune in to the other 4, they will be available up on our website, the National Postdoctoral Association, at nationalpostdoc.org. I want to just point out that you can use the chat function to keep the conversation going. If you have a question and specifically for a speaker, that's something you can put under the Q&A button. Those are at the top of your column on your screen. Where it says chat, Q&A, polls, and handouts. And that last one, handouts, is also full of great materials from our generous presenters here today. If you'd like to download them, and they'll be likely referenced today during the discussion. If you aren't a member already, your membership as an individual in the NPA is most likely free. All postdocs, students, faculty, staff of an organizational member that's already part of the NPA, and there's 215 of them out there, can just sign up for free on our site, and then you'll get our news alerts about events such as this, as well as opportunity to use our resources. You can also follow us on all our major social media outlets, and we hope that you enjoyed this panel as well as this summit as much as I have. And again, make sure to bring this conversation back to your colleagues and institutions to keep moving things forward. So today, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Rebecca Callahan of Out to Innovate, one of our core partners of the NPA. Rebecca.
Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Out to Innovate, I want to say that we're truly delighted to be hosting the final session of this incredible gender equity series. A huge thanks to the National Postdoc Association for planning and hosting this event, and to you all for being here. My name is Rebecca Callahan. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a chemist by training, and I work in science policy, and I think I'm technically a retired postdoc now. As Tom mentioned, I'm on the board of directors of Out to Innovate, and I wanted to share a little bit about Out to Innovate in case you aren't familiar. So we are a professional society for LGBTQ plus folks in all STEM fields. This past year, we just rebranded from the National Organization of Gay and Lesbian Science and Technology Professionals, or NOGLSTEP, in an intentional effort to be more inclusive of all under the LGBTQ and STEM umbrellas. Out to Innovate has been active in advocating for queer and trans scientists for almost 4 years. We provide scholarships and fellowships, some of which are available to postdocs, and I encourage you to check out. We also host a biannual scientific conference, and for years we've been pushing for inclusive and equitable policies within STEM organizations and across the government. We have an ongoing partnership with the NPA for a discount on member dues, so feel free to register to become an Out to Innovate member if you are interested in what we do and want to get more involved. And just before I finish my pitch for Out to Innovate, I also want to share that we are hosting an award ceremony for our recognition awards and the 2021 Ben Barres Fellowship Award winners on July 31st. The Ben Barres Fellowship is for trans, intersex, and non-binary graduate students and postdoc scholars. So you are all officially now invited to join us. It's on a really neat interactive platform that has this retro arcade game vibe. We're going to have poster presentations from the fellows and an incredible keynote speaker, Dr. Tonya Petit. And there's a flyer with more information in the handout section. So our webinar this afternoon is intended to provide perspective on the presence and experiences of LGBTQ folks in academic and research settings. This session is broken into two parts, and we're starting with a system-level overview and then moving into a more individual view in which our panelists will share their experiences navigating career changes post-PhD. I hope this will be relevant to all of you here, whether you're an LGBTQ postdoc considering your next steps, whether you are an ally and curious about ways you can better advocate for your queer and trans colleagues, or whether you are an administrator thinking about equity and inclusion and hiring practices. The webinar is going to be kicked off first by a talk from Dr. John Freeman. We are really delighted to have John here. He has been a critical voice calling for federal statistical agencies to track sexual orientation and gender identity data. And I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but I will tease that his efforts have led to some really instrumental initial changes. So his talk is going to be followed by a short Q&A and followed up by a panel discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John.
Hello. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for the National Postdoctoral Association for hosting this important panel. Let me just load the slides. And let me, sorry, 1 second. Okay. So I'll start by saying that I am a my lab and I study the cognitive and neurobiological mechanisms underlying split-second social judgments and less conscious forms of bias. And I think my work on less conscious forms of bias has sort of informed my perspective on the issue of LGBTQ plus challenges in STEM. And I, from personal experiences, from once I became tenured, from hearing from junior faculty, from postdocs, obviously that's what we're focusing on here, and graduate students alike, of the numerous issues that LGBTQ plus folks in STEM are facing. And this led me to write a piece in Nature in 2018 called "LGBTQ Scientists Are Still Left Out," trying to raise awareness of LGBTQ plus challenges in STEM. And that led me to find the few but important studies that exist, some of which I'll talk about today, on the disparities that LGBTQ plus people are facing in STEM. And what I recognized there was that one of the major issues, as much as we try to think of how can we change, say, the postdoc environment to make it more welcoming and inclusive for LGBTQ plus folks, we can do all that, but without demographic data collection that can help STEM institutions benchmark where they're at and move forward, and the kinds of demographic data that we've long had for gender, for race, ethnicity, and disability in STEM, for a very long time. Without that demographic data, we really can't hold STEM institutions accountable, and we can't really translate this information into policymaking, into the allocation of federal resources. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the efforts Rebecca just mentioned, but I just want everyone to know that the reason for this, I think, in terms of moving forward, is that to really change the culture, we need the data. And without, we can't improve things if we can't measure them. And this is really about measuring them so we can improve them. So I just want to start by noting that LGBTQ disparities in STEM, if and where they exist, hurt scientific progress. And so the 1980 Science and Engineering Equal Opportunities Act stated, quote, "It is in the national interest to promote the full use of human resources in science and engineering." And the idea is that if there are barriers or disparities or challenges faced on the basis of gender, on the basis of race or ethnicity or disability, or also on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, that's going to raise issues not only of equal opportunity, but represent a waste of STEM talent that hinders US scientific and technological progress. And so it's important not only from an equal opportunity standpoint, but also from a STEM talent perspective, that we understand what's going on with this population and make sure that we can reduce, if not eliminate, any disparities that they might be facing. And when we think of the latest estimates of the LGBTQ population in the US, which is 5.6% of the US population, and this rises to 10% or so from 18 to 37-year-olds. This is a substantial portion of the US STEM workforce, right? And so we really need to understand what's going on with this population. So what I'm going to be talking about is that the federal agency responsible for collecting this information, the National Science Foundation, has not collected sex orientation and gender identity in its US STEM education and workforce surveys. So we don't have the official information that can translate into policymaking, that can translate into the allocation of federal resources and understand these issues in a comprehensive, nationally representative way. Nevertheless, researchers have begun to look at the disparities that might be faced by these individuals. And estimates suggest that LGBTQ people are 17 to 21% less represented in the STEM workforce than statistically expected based on their prevalence in the US population. And researchers have looked to other federal surveys because NSF doesn't collect this information. And so looked at, for example, the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which doesn't have an actual sex orientation measure, but it does allow respondents to indicate whether they're in an other sex or same sex couple. So for analyses that only look at couples, there are caveats there, but nevertheless, it's a valuable analysis. These data show that men in same-sex couples are less likely to complete an undergraduate STEM degree and be in a STEM occupation relative to their counterparts who are in other sex couples. The same pattern is replicated among sexual minority men, meaning those who identify as gay, bisexual, or queer, versus straight men in the CDC's National Health Interview Survey, which did have an actual sex orientation measure. When we look at the gap size in STEM bachelor's degrees, what we see is that this male sex orientation gap is larger than the racial gap in terms of Black individuals earning fewer STEM degrees than white individuals, but smaller than the gender gap in terms of women earning fewer STEM degrees than men. Other researchers have looked at the undergraduate period in particular, finding that compared to straight men, for example, sexual minority men are 13% more likely to leave STEM for a non-STEM major from freshman to senior year, even though critically it's those sexual minority men who actually show the greater signs of interest and engagement in STEM in terms of research and lab participation, which may suggest that as they get more involved in STEM, they're encountering experiences that signal to them that this is a place where they don't belong. So it seems that there are a number of issues here. Other surveys have been conducted which point to similarly serious issues in the kind of non-supportive STEM environments that LGBTQ people are encountering. So LGBTQ people in STEM report more negative workplace experiences than non-LGBTQ people in STEM, and even than their LGBTQ counterparts in non-STEM industries. LGBTQ people in STEM are more likely to experience career barriers, harassment, and professional devaluation than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. Roughly 70%, some surveys have suggested, 70% of sexual minority STEM faculty members who are out at work report feeling uncomfortable in their department. More than 40% of LGBTQ people in STEM are not out to their colleagues. And the American Physical Society conducted a survey, so some STEM fields have conducted internal surveys of their fields, which found that 21% of LGBTQ people in US physics reported being excluded, intimidated, or harassed at work due to being LGBTQ. 75% reported feeling uncomfortable at work, and these predicted a desire to leave STEM. So what can we do about this accumulating evidence of LGBTQ disparities in STEM? Well, and first, before I get into that, briefly just mention the plausible factors that might be driving these disparities without comprehensive and increased research on the topic. We really don't have a mechanistic understanding of what's going on, but plausibly anti-LGBTQ bias and discrimination. There's still plenty of that going on in the United States and in the general workforce, certainly. STEM stereotypes in terms of even less consciously in terms of beliefs and expectations about who is the ideal scientist that prescribe a scientist to be masculine as well as heterosexual and cisgender could be causing some of these issues. And it's these masculine STEM stereotypes in particular that might be explaining this asymmetry that researchers are finding between sexual minority men, whereas the sexual minority women are not being observed as having as much disparities as a sexual minority men. And if we have time, I'm happy to talk about this. There's considerable research on this topic in terms of the literature on women in STEM. And then finally, unique norms of impersonality in STEM that kind of go above and beyond the traditional norms of professionalism in other industries. that in my mind might be exacerbating the isolation that LGBTQ people are encountering, discouraging identity disclosures, and preventing LGBTQ people from finding peers and role models, which we know to be so key to the retention of underrepresented individuals in STEM. Of course, more research is needed to better understand the mechanisms here, which is in part what I'm trying to do in terms of some of these efforts. So in my mind, the biggest step and the key barrier to progress is that our official nationwide surveys on US STEM do not include sex orientation and gender identity measures. And what we're talking about here are the National Science Foundation's National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is the federal statistical agency at NSF responsible for these surveys. And these collect a variety of surveys. I'll briefly go into them here. The National Survey of College Graduates, which is a biennial national representative survey of 164,000 bachelor degree recipients across all fields, conducted by the US Census Bureau on behalf of NSF. The Survey of Doctorate Recipients, which is a biennial nationally representative survey of 120,000 PhD degree recipients in STEM only. And then the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which is an annual census of every single newly minted PhD in the United States across all fields, not just STEM. It's typically mandated by doctoral institutions to receive the PhD, which leads to a very high response rate of roughly 92%. And NSF works closely with doctoral institutions to facilitate this and also provides them back the data. So this is an enormously valuable set of surveys that, as I'll show you here, these surveys are collected by NSF. NSF generates reports like the Women, Minorities, and Persons with Disabilities in Science and Engineering report and the Science and Engineering Indicators report. These are then sent to National Institutes of Health, to Congress and policymakers, to university diversity offices, to researchers, to scientific organizations, and they're enormously critical for STEM diversity efforts, for understanding what's going on, including in the postdoc environment, and for universities to understand what's going on at various stages of the STEM pipeline, as well as the federal government, obviously. If sex orientation and gender identity were collected in these surveys and included in official surveys and reports, it would allow researchers and policymakers to track LGBTQ disparities in career and educational barriers that they might face, including, of course, how these might intersect with race and economic background or disability, allow for the development and testing of strategies to increase the retention of LGBTQ people in STEM if and where there are leakages in the pipeline, help universities, funding agencies, and scientific societies prevent or stop bias and pipeline issues, inform directly NSF and NIH diversity initiatives in terms of things like the Graduate Research Fellowship Program or the National Research Service Award or other funding mechanisms, and allow, because these surveys and these statistical underrepresentation in these surveys are what are necessary for NSF and NIH diversity initiatives, as well as university diversity initiatives for recruiting faculty and trainees, and also more generally help to change the conversation in STEM more broadly. The fact that this information is included in official surveys and reports helps change the conversation such that LGBTQ identity is a recognized form of STEM diversity. And so given the importance of these data, for the past 3 years, I've been leading an effort urging the National Science Foundation and the White House Office of Management and Budget, which has to approve NSF's changes to its surveys, to include sex orientation and gender identity demographic questions on these surveys. This was supported by 17 major scientific organizations, including, for example, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. And we're continuing to encourage NSF and OMB to include these questions. And there's been a whole timeline, as you can see here, of formally urging NSF and OMB to include these questions and over the past 3 years. And back in 2018, this led to NSF to indicate that they would begin piloting these questions on national workforce surveys. Unfortunately, due to what NSF indicated as being limited time and resources, they delayed the piloting and finally, because of our continued pressure, began the piloting as of April 2021. And I'm going to be talking about that in just a moment. Since this time, since 2018, there's been a National Academies report on the well-being of LGBTQI+ populations, which explicitly recommended, due to the accumulating evidence of these LGBTQ disparities in STEM, explicitly recommended that NSF add sex orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, demographic questions to its surveys. And what I want to talk about now, because NSF raised a number of feasibility issues. These questions would be too sensitive, would be too personal for respondents. These might violate privacy and confidentiality issues. These might have identifiability and disclosure issues, right? Numerous feasibility issues. And I want to make everyone who's in the audience comfortable and about including these questions and understand it as briefly as possible. So as an initial matter, just want to note that major federal surveys have been collecting SOGI data for several years without issue. So for example, the current population survey, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system survey. So, you know, federal agencies surveys on the US population have been collecting sex orientation and gender identity completely fine without issue for a number of years now, right? So these are very feasible questions to ask respondents. SOGI questions are voluntary. There's no personal mandate to respond. So no respondent has to provide NSF, for example, with their sex orientation or gender identity, should they not want to. The privacy and confidentiality of personally identifiable data in these surveys are strongly protected by federal law. And so respondents can't be identified or exposed to discrimination without violating federal law. NSF and the US Census Bureau, who collects data on behalf of NSF with the National Survey of College Graduates, suppress data cells that have too few respondents to prevent possible identifiability or disclosure. So going through great lengths to make sure that respondents can't be identified. And generally, respondents react very favorably to SOGI questions in federal surveys, and they elicit fewer sensitivity reactions than other commonly measured demographic questions like income and disability. So just to give you a case study on the federal statistical agency that's closest and most comparable to NSF, National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, and in my mind, really shows the shortcomings of NSF in this process, is that here, right, in 2012, the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics recognized the need to introduce SOGI measures wherever possible in national education surveys. In 2015, they conducted piloting, which showed that the questions were feasible and beneficial. And in 2016, SOGI questions were added to national surveys of high schoolers and college students, which were very beneficial, didn't cause any issues. You know, for the past 3 years, we've been encouraging NSF to include these questions. Meanwhile, a comparable federal statistical agency on national education surveys has been including these questions since 2016 without any issue. So let's get into it for a moment in terms of the actual data. What federal statistical agencies are often looking at in terms of, is this question too personal? Is it too sensitive? Is it causing issues for respondents? Are break-off rates, meaning respondents see the question and they decide to exit the survey altogether because presumably they're uncomfortable. Item non-response rates, meaning that they see the question and they skip it. Or seconds to complete the question, which might suggest it's too sensitive, it might be undue cost or burden to respondents. And you're seeing demographic questions of birth, sex, gender identity, sex orientation, income, and disability. This is the 2016 follow-up to the 2009 high school longitudinal study of 23,000 high school freshmen initially assessed in 2009. And across the board, what you're seeing is that, you know, birth, sex, gender identity, and sex orientation are taking less time to respond, are eliciting fewer sensitivity reactions than other commonly measured questions, namely income and disability. So even back in 2016, with the federal statistical agency that's most comparable to NSF and CSES, we're seeing that these questions, if anything, income and disability are causing more issues than birth, sex, gender identity, and sex orientation. So all that's to say, these are very feasible questions to ask respondents. So finally, as of April 2021, due to our continued pressure and encouragement of NSF and OMB to include these questions, NSF has begun piloting SOGI questions. And I think I can certainly say on behalf of my colleagues at AAAS and the American Educational Research Association and myself, we're thrilled that NSF sees the importance of this issue and is starting to pilot these questions finally. And we want to do everything we can to help NSF and CSES move along with this process. So I'm going to tell you about the two studies that NSF is currently conducting right now. It's currently conducting an online convenience sample of 2,800 respondents to test, are there any effects of the order in which these questions are provided to respondents or the response options as they're provided to respondents, as well as follow-up questioning of, do respondents understand the questions? Are they comfortable with these questions? Do they feel that the response accurately captures how they feel about these identities? And what you're seeing are sex orientation and gender identity questions that have been used in some of the numerous federal surveys I talked about earlier, like the current population survey. And what you're seeing, here's a sex orientation question. For gender identity, you're seeing a question about current gender identity, as well as assigned sex at birth. And this is referring to the two-step gender identity method. And the way that this works, and I should say that we're very pleased that NSF is piloting this, the two-step gender identity method, because we specifically advocated for this approach, and I'll tell you why in just a second. So the way that this works is that respondents are marked as gender minorities if they either describe themselves as transgender or they report an assigned birth sex that is different from their current gender identity. And the reason for this is that population-based surveys that simply add a transgender or non-binary option to a binary sex question, so basically just expanding, if NSF just expanded its binary sex question to include a transgender option, it's very likely that it would identify roughly 5 times fewer gender minority respondents than this two-step method. It's also the case that the National Center for Education Statistics showed in 2015 with its piloting that this is the least confusing approach for respondents. So we're very pleased that NSF has heeded our call in piloting and hopefully implementing this approach in terms of assessing gender and gender identity. The NSF is also conducting on 5,000 respondents as part of this year's National Survey of College Graduates, a nationally representative non-production panel, so it doesn't get officially published and used for official reports and available to researchers, but it's for internal survey changes on these 5,000 respondents. But what's critical is that it's nationally representative, right? It's carefully sampled, which is being used to test the likely disclosure risk of the LGBTQ population, break-off and non-response rates, and the time spent on SOGI questions. And what you're seeing is that NSF NCSES has decided to use an expanded set of sex orientation and gender identity options, where select all that apply is allowed. And you have responses like asexual, pansexual, or fluid, or gender non-conforming, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer. And when we look at these expanded options, these expanded sex orientation options for a moment, and we look at other recent federal surveys, I'm showing you one here from 2020 that use the exact same sex orientation question, this more traditional sex orientation measure from the previous study, right, that numerous federal surveys have already used. What you generally see is that only, for the something else write-in option, only 1.5% of respondents are using this something else. And among those write-ins, only 16% could be classified as a sexual minority. So things like pansexual, queer, or asexual, meaning that roughly 0.24% of respondents seem to be preferring to use these asexual, pansexual, fluid options above and beyond these more traditional sex orientation options and these more traditional sex orientation measures. So what I imagine one of the things NSF NCSES is doing here is determining whether this 0.24% of respondents is allowing for these expanded options is providing important information that reduces measurement error, while also you have to recognize these response options can't be unduly confusing, especially to non-sexual minority heterosexual respondents, right? Because that will create more measurement error. So there has to be this careful balancing where everyone, including non-sexual minority respondents, understand these questions and non-gender minority understand the gender identity questions, while also wanting to reduce measurement error. And that's how federal statistical agencies at least think about this issue. One thing I just want to note, this has come up a lot in our discussions with NSF over the past 3 years, is that the current estimates of the LGBTQ population, as I mentioned earlier, is 5.6% of the US population. NSF has long been collecting information on racial and ethnic categories that have a far smaller prevalence in the US population. Asians, American Indians and Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are all racial and ethnic classifications in federal surveys that have a much smaller prevalence than the LGBTQ population. So generally speaking, issues of identifiability or disclosure risk should not be insurmountable, at least, and should not be a major concern that prevents the possible inclusion of these questions for NSF surveys. And hopefully the piloting confirms that. So these pilot studies are geared toward implementation on the National Survey of College Graduates, and NSF NCSES has indicated to us that additional work would be needed to add SOGI questions to other surveys, like the Survey of Earned Doctorates, which is, again, the annual census of all newly minted PhD in the United States across all fields, not just STEM, which arguably is probably the most important and critical data set for policymaking, for understanding what's going on in the STEM workforce, because this is the census of all PhDs. And as we're thinking about the postdoc environment, this is really critical because this is the exact feeder population into that postdoc environment. And it's typically mandated by doctoral institutions, which results in its very high response rate. NSF indicates that because of the large number of temporary visa holders, there might need to be cross-cultural testing. Because personally identifiable data are provided back to doctoral institutions, privacy and informed consent statements might need revision. And while I certainly understand these important methodological issues, I really want to stress that there is an urgency to this, I think. And I think many in the USM community agree with that. And I think NSF could work on this in parallel and hopefully can move quickly on this. So this is, for example, as a doctoral student who just graduated, this was April 28th. Honestly, cannot believe that these are the only options in a mandatory NSF survey I just had to take, no less, when they have an entire Office of Diversity and Inclusion. We need our scientific institutions to do better than this, and you're seeing only binary sex options. And what I'd want to stress is that, you know, this very high response rate that is necessary, because this is a census, right? This is supposed to be every PhD in the United States, could go down because respondents are finding that these questions, this is a constraining question that is inconsistent with their own diversity commitments. It's also going to cause measurement error, obviously, for gender minority respondents. And also, this could cause issues for doctoral institutions in terms of graduate deans that might take issue with mandating the survey for their doctoral population, their doctoral students at their university, because these NCSES's response options are inconsistent with the diversity commitments of those institutions of higher education. And so I think there's an urgency to this, and that I hope NSF can move as quickly as possible in doing this additional work to try to implement these questions. Finally, I just want to note that there are really big issues at play, not only for getting these questions added to NSF surveys, but you know, race and ethnicity federal data collection is standardized by an OMB policy directive, which mandates that every federal survey, whatever the federal agency, which obviously includes NSF, has to collect race and ethnicity in the same manner. And it's possible that OMB could set federal-wide SOGI data standards, which then NSF would have to follow. And of course, this would be enormously valuable for STEM, for higher education, for immigration, for education, for housing, for employment, right? So this is an enormously big issue. And there's two initiatives right now I just want to alert everyone to that could lead to federal-wide SOGI data standards. One is President Biden's executive order on underserved populations and equity, which established an equitable data working group that is tasked with improving federal data collection to better capture the diversity of the American people. Another is that there's an ongoing National Academy's consensus study on measuring sex, gender identity, and sex orientation for the NIH, which could make OMB policy recommendations, which could standardize the federal data collection of sex orientation and gender identity across all federal surveys, which then NSF would follow. But just want to say that, you know, we are my colleagues at AAAS and ARA are very pleased and grateful that NSF has seen the importance of this issue finally and is starting to make progress. And regardless of the possibility of federal-wide standards, I think it's absolutely critical that NSF start to add these questions. I think there's an urgency to it, and I think many in the USM community agree with that. And again, I know we're talking more generally about the postdoc environment. I'm very excited to hear everyone's perspectives. But in my mind, you know, to benchmark universities in terms of making a hospitable, inclusive, and open environment for LGBTQ individuals in the postdoc environment, for understanding the pipeline issues where we go from PhD students to postdocs to getting tenure track jobs, we can do things in terms of create visibility campaigns. We can do things in terms of create mentorship programs, and all of those are absolutely critical. But we can't hold STEM institutions accountable, and we can't benchmark our own progress until we actually have demographic data at a national level. And then also, you know, universities, funding agencies, and scientific societies in their own populations to understand these issues, in my mind. So with that, I just want to thank the National Postdoctoral Association for putting together this panel, and thank the leadership at AAAS and the American Educational Research Association for their incredible collaboration and support on this issue, as well as Adam Romero, Laura Dorso, Christina Olson, and David Miller. And happy to take questions now or discuss later on. Thank you.
and we'll go ahead and ask those. We have time for at least a couple. But while anyone is submitting their questions, I do actually have a question for you. It's really been powerful to hear about your comparison with the Education Statistical Society comparison. And I'm wondering, in light of the audience that we have here today, do you think that those findings would translate to a non-federal survey? So for example, if it's a professional society or if it's a workplace survey, do you think that folks would have the same feelings about this is not information that's too sensitive or too personal to be asking?
Sure. So do you mean would the survey practitioners, the people collecting the data at, say, a scientific society or a university, with it? Yeah. So I've had numerous conversations about this issue, and it's a very important one. I think that fortunately, STEM education and workforce research, or some higher education institutes, have added sex orientation and gender identity questions, and so they've done that in terms of. But those are actual STEM education and workforce researchers. In terms of my conversations, I've only had a few with university provost offices or diversity offices. What they've really centered on were liability, to be honest. They basically said, the real talk is that the reason we collect demographic data is because to prevent liability lawsuits, right? In terms of that they've been discriminating on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, and that they can show that they haven't been doing it. And so they basically said, until this is a liability issue, they're probably not going to collect these data. And now, but I think a lot has changed in terms of last year's Supreme Court decision, which made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of sex orientation and gender identity, federally in terms of employment. And then President Biden's executive order 13988, which strengthened those anti-discrimination protections and extended them to education, housing, and immigration. And actually, to one wonderfully positive and surprising thing about NSF and CSCS that they've done is that they actually had an open call for to fund in a broad agency announcement qualitative research on how are private STEM employers, how are universities, how are federal agencies thinking about SOGI data collection as we move forward. So although they haven't been as on the ball as we would like in terms of their own national data collection, they are thinking about, with these recent changes in terms of the Supreme Court decision and President Biden's executive order, that this is now a liability issue for universities, right? There's now legal recourse if there's discrimination on the basis of sex orientation and gender identity. So STEM employers need to start thinking about collecting these data to understand these issues. Of course, this is putting aside, these data need to be collected for any STEM institution that wants to attract LGBTQ talent, ensure equity, and make sure that everyone in their institution is doing all right. Also, this is a gender equity summit, but just collecting in 2021 demographic data in terms of a binary sex question, from a very measurement error standpoint, you're missing out on a lot of information, right? In terms of all the gender minority respondents and the complex ways that gender identity takes place. So those are my thoughts. Finally, just very quickly, climate surveys are of course conducted by scientific societies, and there's generally been an openness to include these questions on climate surveys. It's just, you have to make sure that this is clear to scientific societies. I will say that, interestingly enough, gender identity, because there's already exists, right? These surveys have been going on since 1957. There's already a binary sex question. So the fact that this is sort of a binary sex question is missing out on important information, and that gender identity should be collected is a very natural step, where sex orientation for a lot of decision makers at scientific societies and universities and federal agencies, I think, is a much bigger deal because it seems invasive, right? So if anything, gender identity, and NSF was going to include only gender identity. They were going to omit sex orientation, and we specifically took issue with that and advocated to NSF and OMB that they should definitely include sex orientation, and they reversed course and they did include sex orientation. And so I think we're going to be seeing a lot of movement probably with gender identity first, but I really hope for the entire LGBTQ plus community, obviously, that sex orientation is also included in that. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Well, I greatly appreciate it. And if there's any other questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat. But I think right now we're going to move into the second portion of the webinar. So as has already been stated, one of the unique challenges of being LGBTQ in research and academia is having these multiple identities. For example, for me, being a queer woman and a scientist, how do these identities overlap and how are they compartmentalized? So a presenter earlier today, and then John also shared this, shared that more than 40% of LGBT workers are not actually out to their colleagues. So it really isn't a hypothetical question. Navigating that, how do you come out if you need to come out at work, in addition to assessing whether we're going to feel safe and welcome in a potential work environment. So to bring a bit of that personal perspective to this, we have 3 additional panelists who will join for a moderated Q&A. And each of these panelists is truly incredible in their own work and their own right. And we're just grateful for them to be here to share a bit of their time and perspective on this very personal matter. So I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves about themselves and about their research and career journey one at a time. So I'd love to start with Dr. Penn Hutchinson.
Thank you. So my name is Pendleton Hutchinson. I go by Penn. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am queer and non-binary. And using they, them, theirs programs, I don't have much of a choice being out at work. We can definitely talk about that later. I am currently an assistant professor of chemistry at St. Bonaventure University. Research-wise, I'm really an environmental analytical chemist. I got my Ph.D. from Iowa State in 2017 in analytical chemistry. Then I did a postdoc at Willamette University from 2017 to 2019. I spent a year as a visiting assistant professor at Texas A&M University, Texas A&M International University. And then I am currently I began my current position in August 2020. And I really got into research and science because I was the kid who was always asking why. And I don't think I really stopped until I had a doctorate, asking my mom all the time, well, why does it do that? I started looking it up myself, but I always wanted to know more. I wanted to know why, I wanted to know how. And that led me to a bachelor's in chemistry, and then eventually to my PhD in chemistry at Iowa State. My doctoral work focused on high-resolution mass spectrometry and biofuels, really looking at them on the molecular level. What's in there, what compounds are in there, how much of every compound is in there, when do they form, where do they come from? But after my doctoral work, I really wanted to shift back to what got me started asking why all the time, because I grew up in a really rural area. I was out in nature all the time, and that's what drove my scientific curiosity. So I made a purposeful shift away from sort of fuels and similar research to environmental chemistry. And my postdoc, I made another shift in there in that I moved towards primarily undergraduate institutions. So Willamette University only has about 2,000 students. The chemistry department is only awarding bachelor's degrees, and all the research is done by undergraduates. So I did my postdoc alongside independent undergraduate researchers. There, I looked into the fates and sources of estrogens in the environment, which was definitely an interesting area to be in, looking at hormones as a non-binary person. So with the estrogens, what I was looking at is, again, sort of the how much, what kind, does the how much change with the seasons, and what happens to these compounds into the environment? What's sort of the environmental impact? Now, I didn't do research at my visiting assistant professorship, but I had a really valuable experience at Texas A&M International University. It's on the US-Mexico border, and when I say it's on the border, I mean it is on the border. Laredo is actually 2 different cities. There is Laredo in the United States and Nuevo Laredo in Mexico. So our students came from both. Again, we only had bachelors in chemistry. We had just undergraduates doing the research. I taught general chemistry and environmental chemistry there. And that was a really valuable experience moving into St. Bonaventure, which is also a PUI, very small, about 1,800 students. And there I teach analytical chemistry and general chemistry, and I conduct my research now with undergraduates. It's undergraduates doing independent research under me. My research there really focuses on anticoagulant rodenticides. So I've gotten really hardcore back into the nature, what's in it, and what's happening to the critters. So I'm looking at quantities, sources, fates, And I'm moving towards doing some non-invasive monitoring of non-target species. So critters that aren't rodents that are getting into these anti-rodenticides, anticoagulant rodenticides. And that's kind of where I started from a rural kid, and I've kind of come full circle to be a rural professor.
That sounds like an incredible journey. Thank you for sharing it. And next we'll have Dr. Vivian Miranda.
Hello, can you all hear me? I have some slides. I promise I just took I'm not gonna take 20 minutes. I'm gonna take 7 minutes. So can you all see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm Vivian Miranda. I'm a Ph.D. in instrumental physics at the University of Chicago. Currently a research scientist at U of A, and next year I will be an assistant professor at Stony Brook. So I want to start with good news. As a starting point, the United States has awesome example of transgender women in STEM. This is not just to mention a couple of them, and they are older. It means they are senior. That means that they are in more positions of power in academia, which is very important, so they can make actual decisions. I'm a Brazilian, so I always try to make sure I compare USA to Brazil, because it's a very interesting comparison in many ways. Brazil has a very strong transgender community in general. And there's also lots of transgender women in academia in Brazil in STEM, but you can see the differences in age between USA and Brazil. So Brazil is like 20 years behind, and that means that most of the cases that I know, they're either assistant professor or just got tenure, which means that there's not enough time for them to get in positions of power, positions that they can really make changes in their environment. So that's a big thing. So as John talked brilliantly, I'm gonna offer some of my personal hints, but it does not replace statistical data. I know about some of these sources on APS and archive. He has mentioned many of the services on NSF, which was very interesting to me, for example. So from my personal experience, just stating that we will welcome diversity is not enough, and why is that? Well, first, because judgment is an integral part of academia. We judge each other, we judge our peers based on a scientific merit and teaching and everything. It's part of our job. And the problem is that each one of us has a moral, inherent moral value that is a linear combination of these 5 dimensions here. And we don't know what is the particular linear combination of our advisors or the department chairs, and this inherent moral values can affect our judgment and can affect their judgment. And if their judgment is affected, that has a direct impact in our ability to continue in academia, because our continuation, our progress in the field depends on the judgment of senior researchers and senior professors. So here I'm just getting one of many examples of things that I'm in the past. I was in a job interview, I was in the short list, and the only thing I asked was my preferred name to be respected, and I got this feedback that I lost the job because I was too much trans and not enough physicists, which I found baffling, because again, the only thing I talked about was physics. The only thing I asked was prefer them to be respected, and I think the second part is very important, that it shocked the old members of committee, and that is why I think the age of professors that are in LGBTQ is very important. We are evaluated by professors and administrators that are much older with a very different generation. So for them, it's hard to understand us. And that cannot have a direct implication in our ability to get jobs and to maintain ourselves in academia. So there's a whole thing that's important, is that how we overcome these a priori fears that we don't know who is judging us. That we know who is judging us, our advisors and our department. We don't know their inherent moral values. So I think organizations like OSTEM can be pretty important for grad students and also for postdocs. Give talks to your local STEM organization. So, and I know in the United States there is this big, like two sides of, free speech versus diversity, and I don't think there's a two sides. I think I embrace the University of Chicago mantra, and I think diversity is required to fully realize our free speech values, because you need people from different backgrounds and different history in order to get different perspective on a particular problem that you're discussing at the university or in your class. At the same point, because we come from such different worlds, I always try to teach my students and myself the principle of charitable interpretations, that I always interpret other people's statements in the best way possible, not in the most offensive way possible. Otherwise, miscommunication can happen on a daily basis and can be with catastrophic consequences. So what are the specific things that I face? One is preferred names. That can be a bureaucratic nightmare. Some universities, like UPenn at the time, I was there, say, oh, you can just change your name. That is not true for international students. I'm an international scholar. That means that I have to go back to my country does allow names to be changed, which is a big plus. Not all countries ask us that, but to do that, I have to come back to Brazil and stay 1 year until I get my new passports, because you have to renew all the documents from your birth certificate. Then you have to go to the United States and somehow link your visa to the new name. That's not an easy process. So, and we cannot stay a year abroad. So for international scholars, we cannot change our names, and that can be a really, really big issue. And to my good surprise, University of Arizona is actually a linear example. It's really easy to get our preferred names in the system here. So being first matters. So I was the first transgender postdoc at UPenn Astro and Physics. So with my example, UPenn, for example, now is working on better HR and better systems for preferred names, because they understand now that for international scholars that can be an issue. And bathrooms, and that's a delicate issues, because if you don't have your preferred name respecting your card, and you have some miscommunication in the bathroom where someone else calls security, that can go to a life-threatening situation really, really fast. So that was always my fear, because I didn't have my preferred name respected. Here I have in the card. No, I was, in the actual card document that I can show to the security of the police, the police on campus, that say, look, I'm a transgender woman. Here's my preferred name. That's why I'm using this bathroom. I understand why the person called. Let's discuss. But it helps not making this a life-threatening situation. But outside, it can also, can be an issue. And we know that in some states, in São Paulo, for example, which is the leading state for science in Brazil, but also in states in the United States, like on Texas, there are very bizarre bills about these bathrooms that will make this issue big. So how do we handle that? And that is something that can impact your day-to-day. One thing that was real difficult for me is international travel. There are conferences that are important and happens all around the world, and the world becomes a lot smaller if you're LGBTQ+. I can only travel at first order approximation to the blue states. For example, I'm pretty sure I travel to China, even though it's gray, but to first order approximations, it's only the blue. And even inside Brazil, I cannot travel to places that have lost conferences in Brazil, because I didn't feel safe to go to that particular place. Especially if so conferences love to go to isolated places where you have to get some buzz at night, there's no one, and this can be a real issue because you don't know the place, and it can be quite dangerous. And this is real. So here, there's Gigi Gorgeous, which is a transgender YouTuber. She has all her documents rectified, but at some country, which doesn't matter what countries, I'm not shaming particular countries in this presentation, she was detained because the person probably follow her on YouTube and knew she was transgender, and by just being transgender, she was detained. She was almost put in jail, and there was a huge diplomatic thing to let her out, and her only crime was being trans. So that can be a real issue, and somehow the COVID thing with more online presentations alleviate that, but this is a problem that will come back and we return. And going to conferences is a great. I got my U of A job at a conference when talking to people, and so is an missed opportunity that can affect our prospects in academia. Medical treatment in the US can also be a possible nightmare because some public institutions cannot provide care for transgender individuals. And United States, it's really expensive, the medical treatment if you don't have proper health insurance. So, this is, I was very fortunate that UPenn covered most of 99.9% of my costs. But, this is something that the universities have to get into. Now, does your health insurance, does the university cover the costs of hormone treatments and some surgeries? For example, U of A doesn't for some surgeries, and actually a transgender factor here that is in the state Supreme Court against the state legislator because he cannot get all the treatment he needs. One thing that is a difficult topic is that when you're the first, media attention is inevitable. Like, I got an insane amount of media attention in Brazil because I don't know why, but it just got it. I denied 99% of them, but the 1% that I accepted because I thought that was important to get, got me into trouble into academia there. So because faculty don't like, departments don't like media attentions, so they say that you're getting the media attention by the double quotes, the wrong reasons, and that can also impact your prospect. But it's important to have, it's important because the power of example is crucial. I didn't have examples. I didn't thought it was possible to be transgender in science, and that's why I delayed my transition beyond what was humanely acceptable. But there is also very good. That's why I like this comparison between Brazil and United States. Now, Brazil has a lot of problems, but at the same time, it has the most revolutionary program for transgender individuals that I ever seen in my life, which is the trans employment that recruited over 1,000 companies and taught them and made them sure that they could hire transgender individuals, and from bottom of the company to CEO level, and that is and this program has changing the demographics. So like before this program, 95% of transgenders in Brazil work in prostitution, and this is changing because of programs like this. And so I'd like to end with just exemplify the power of examples that was taught by John. Is that why did I wait 28 years for transition? Is because in the distant past, any Google search or I'm so old that I was before Google, but I forgot what's the search web at that point. If you search the word travesti, which is the Brazilian synonym of transgender, you only result in websites like this that are completely disgusting. They treat us like piece of meat. So you don't think it's possible. But right now, if you do that, you find a lot of articles about me, and I think that's important for the new generation because it tells them it's possible. You only need one example to show a lot of people that it's possible, and that is my introduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vivian, and I am just delighted to hear how you've ended on the fact that you are now that mentor and the leader for folks to follow. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dain Simelo.
Hi, everyone. So my introduction is rather short, but I do need to preface by saying that although I am a AAAS fellow supporting the Department of Defense, everything I say does not reflect the views or opinions of either DoD or AAAS. So with that being said, My background is in immunology and infectious disease, so you can imagine I had to cut off all social media during this pandemic because it was very stressful. And following my graduate work, I went to work for a medcoms agency for a very brief period before starting this current fellowship. And what I work on in my office is workforce development, specifically with diversity, equity, and inclusion in mind, and evaluating that at the defense laboratories.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And John, would you like to say anything more about your career before we kick off with questions?
I'm happy to, but if you want to go right to questions in the interest of time, whichever you want.
That sounds good. Let's do questions. And I'm just going to put the call out again for folks to go ahead and submit questions to the Q&A. But I do have a couple that I would love to hear from any of you who are interested in answering. But to get at that, perspective from maybe the administrators, before you joined your current workplace, how did you assess the inclusivity of the employers or the work environment? And did that play a large role in you deciding to take that position? And I think you're just gonna turn on your microphone and answer.
So I can kind of start off on this one. What I did was I first kind of narrowed down my search, and I actually narrowed it down by hobbies first, because I have some hobbies that are fairly niche and fairly important to me. Then from there, once I had sort of that narrowed down, I knocked out states where it was going to be really, really hard to be non-binary. And it's kind of funny saying that because I did work in Texas for a year, but I also looked then at Campus Pride Index to get a sense of the undergraduate and graduate LGBT inclusion as much as you can with that. There's some caveats with that. And I also looked for really strong diversity and inclusion policies with actual actionable items. So things like letting undergraduates choose their given name. That's not always all translated to faculty, and it very often doesn't translate to faculty, but it's definitely a sign that that's going to be something better. Letting students select pronouns, having actionable diversity and inclusion initiatives, which these have become easier to spot over the last 18 months or so, if it's just writing on a page or if there's actually something that they're trying to do to improve diversity, inclusion, equity, anything at that university.
I can hop in really quickly. As you might imagine, like the same with laboratories, how they're all kind of their microcosms of culture. It's the same thing with the offices in government or like an agency that I worked at in industry. And kind of parsing that out can be difficult without explicit metrics. But I think, I tried to withhold also my prejudices because I never in a million years imagined myself working at DoD. But it's a great office, and I love a challenge. So,
yeah, I didn't. I mean, this often comes up in questions too for people that are on the market, and my experience was that I mean, it's kind of weird because I didn't do a postdoc, so it's kind of strange to be giving any advice in the postdoc environment, but. In that, my main job search year, I interviewed at two places that both were like rural and was definitely their first LGBTQ person in the department. And I had an experience where one of them, I was asked 13 times, do you have a wife? And had to engage in that conversation each time. And then in another, there was sort of a ridiculous thing that happened with respect to my sexual orientation. And I talk about these things in my Nature piece in 2018. But I took a job, and my first job was at Dartmouth College, where, I was fortunately able to move to NYU 2 years later. And it was great. It's not to in any way say anything was wrong with it, but in terms of having the ability to connect with that community and sort of their exposure to these things. And I don't know where they fall on Campus Pride Index, but I can't imagine it's at the top of the list. I sort of just was willing, I guess, to take the hit. And I realized that comes with privileges that I have in terms of I'm not really multiply marginalized on other identities, for example. And so I certainly recognize that. But I was kind of willing to deal with this negative experiences with respect to my sexual orientation to, I don't know, advance my career, I guess, and take the first job. And I'm not at all saying that that's what people should do. And I certainly understand what I often advise PhD students and postdocs, that is not the thing that they like to hear. But this is an extremely competitive job market that people face. And what I worry about is PhDs and postdocs and the attrition that happens because there's only a couple jobs, and often they're not in urban locations, which tend to have probably greater inclusion. And what does that require? It requires reform in academic science in the United States. I mean, funding wise and more positions. But until then, I want to see LGBTQ people continue in academia and in science. And I do think, unfortunately, it requires some kind of maybe temporary sacrifices if people are able to do that. And I certainly realize this happens to do with other various privileges and such, but it's something that I really worry about. And I think once we have the national data and see where the pipeline issues are, I worry especially about that postdoc or PhD to tenure track, but it's really that postdoc to tenure track drop off, because I think there's a lot that's happening. And I think a lot of subtle, implicit ways that LGBTQ people are being discriminated against, essentially. It's sort of in terms of perceived fit, that, this person doesn't seem to fit with our culture here because, they're sort of urbanites and they're not going to actually stay here. We're not going to do a massive lab investment for this person because they're just going to leave in a couple of years, or they are, or that they're not family oriented and they're not going to really stay here. And these are well-intentioned concerns, but what it results in is an implicit discrimination, right, on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that's what I'm concerned about. So I wish I had a more positive message, but those are my thoughts.
I think it was a very genuine answer. And I posted the link to the campus pride index that Penn had referenced in case anyone in the audience is interested in that. How have some of your non-LGBTQ colleagues made you feel really comfortable being out at work? Is there any specific things that you would point to as great allyship?
Making sure that treating me like anyone else. It's, by doing the basics, for me was already, and for the few times where I didn't need some special thing because, bureaucracy or something, then having a department chair, department head that's very understanding, where you can share, like my department, U of A, has 300 and something. I think 99.9% of them don't know about my state ID name, but the department chairs know, of course. So having a great department chair or department president, department head or department chair, plus treating me like anyone else was, it was already good enough for me. There was an advantage that I already came to U of A fully transition. At UPenn, I needed some special accommodation. For example, I remember when I hormone treatment and I was discussing on the board with some postdocs, I just started crying just because you're highly sensitive to the new hormones. And I just asked, forget I'm crying, just focus on the equations. And they were able to do that. Even though they were worried. So that was, that was amazing. So just, try to be to make the ambient as normal as possible, even though there's some quirks in there because your transition, your body's changing. It was perfect for me. Not make that a big issue, which was exactly what happened in some of the messages I show in the slides, for example.
I can echo that, and kind of adding to it, when people use my pronouns without making a big deal out of it and without outing me. There are a lot of people who will say, this is Dr. Hutchinson, they use they, them pronouns, they're non-binary. And it's kind of like, you don't need to tell everyone that information, that's mine to disclose. One thing that's really subtle that I found that helps me feel included a lot is when people mirror my language instead of asking things like, do you have a wife? I use the word partner a lot. And when people actually mirror that back instead of trying to figure out, it helps the inclusion a lot, just mirroring the language that people use.
Yeah, I think, I just think something that's important to consider in academic science and the unique aspects that happen with this industry, because a lot of these, in an evaluative context where you're up for, especially a tenure track job where people are making decisions about, you're going to be one of, 20 to 30 or so colleagues that these people might have for the rest of their lives or working lives. And if that's a non-urban location, these might also, the implication being you're going to be really good friends with these people, right? If you're in the middle of the woods, you want your colleagues to be people that you are going to connect with, et cetera. And I think in those contexts, it can be very challenging because what people are trying to do, even in the example you just gave, where it's sort of, oh, well, maybe I can suss out wife or husband or otherwise, these people, and it can be well-intentioned and they're trying to connect and get to know your personal life better because they might want to recruit you. And it can backfire because they're making assumptions that are unwarranted. And I think my experiences have been that once I have a job, most individuals tend to be, me as just a single gay man in these jobs, are supportive, and a lot of, offensive things have been done that I try to sort of, I see them as well-intentioned people. And I realize that the things that they do I try to just take it with a grain of salt, and that these people don't have bad intentions. But where I really worry is with these things where often it's well-intentioned people that want to connect more. And in the example you're giving, I imagine the introducer to your talk was probably thinking this is a really positive thing to do, and it backfires in a way and can heighten the isolation or feeling like, people don't belong. And so I think it's especially in my mind when people are being up for these tenure track jobs where there's this kind of dancing around, there's all the illegal questions at most universities in terms of you're obviously not supposed to ask about sex orientation, ask about, partner issues, ask about all sorts of things. And yet people do because they want to get to know you and see if they want to make you an offer. And we need to, I think it creates a lot of problems. And just want to, again, reiterate that point. But I think my advice, I guess, for, postdocs would be to make sure you're connecting with other folks in the LGBTQ plus community that might have faced similar issues and been down that path, and know how to, just in my mind, being realistic. And I don't think the answer in my mind is know how to navigate that. So when you are asked if, say, you're a gay man, for example, in my position, and do you have a wife 13 times, you have a good answer that either doesn't damage the rapport and embarrass them and decrease the likelihood they're going to make you a job offer, but also respect yourself and not feel silence. And I didn't do that back in 2012, but I think, figuring that out and not just, I don't think the correct answer or like the best advice I could give is not sort of, well, those are all inappropriate behaviors and I only want to be at a place that supports me fully. And so if that happens, I'm not going, or something like that. I think it's sort of, you want to get the job offer above all else, and then you can make the decision of whether you actually want to go. And maybe you could be the instrument of change, as we were talking about earlier. You could be that department's first LGBTQ plus person, and they could help to learn what that's all about. And not that you need to, or it's your responsibility to be in that position, but that, the culture changes because of that. And just my thoughts, right? But I just think my advice is just get the job offers and talk to role models and peers who have been through this to ensure that happens and you're not, tricked up with these issues, and then figure out what you want to do with that. And if you're willing to, maybe no one wants to be the first LGBTQ plus person that a department has ever seen, but it helps to change the culture, right? So just my thoughts.
And just to go back to the,
go ahead.
Just to go back to the faculty thing quick, this is really amplified at primarily undergraduate institutions where you might have, I'm in a fairly large department of 6 people. You may only have 2 or 3 colleagues. And so that really does change the dynamics, and folks who want to go into PUI should consider that. And it's not necessarily bad, it's not necessarily good.
I just wanted to add on to what everyone was saying, that not only just course corrections from non-LGBT folks who are maybe like directly interacting with you, but also folks like in leadership positions, or course correcting for others when they say something that that might be not very inclusive, right? And most times people will just kind of make those adjustments without event. So those are really kind of helpful instances.
I think that has all been incredibly insightful, and I honestly wish we had another hour. I have like 10 other questions that I wanted to ask, so this time has just flown by, but we are at the end of our session. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, first of all, thank you. All four of you have been phenomenal. We greatly appreciate the information you've shared, and just really appreciate your insights here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tom.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to everybody, to your hard work, Rebecca and OTI. And we look forward, at the NPA, we look forward to working even more closely with Out to Innovate and in advancing this discussion, but also getting some concrete actions. I think the panel today was just very inspiring. So I thank each one of you. It shows a spectrum of issues that still need a ton of work to be done. And we at the NPA are small, but we're absolutely dedicated towards moving the needle on DEI issues. So count us as a partner with you. I can see everything from national data to ID cards to job interview processes, and how both public policy as well as institutional policies really continue to need significant change. So thank you for sharing that with us. And hopefully it's a takeaway that all of us can take back to our institutions and try to make sure we're outspoken at those institutions when issues like this come up, as well as being aware, as many of you have made clear, in our everyday lives and interactions with one another, regardless of identity, just to be very aware and to be very conscientious and accepting of one another. So thank you for that. Thank you for closing out our first ever Gender Equity Summit. It's been a pleasure as the NPA to put it on. This is our fifth and final panel. So it was wonderful to have this particular set of speakers close it out for us. These sessions were recorded, and all 5 of them will be up at our website. It's up there on the screen, nationalpostdoc.org, in case any of you are listening in by audio only. And it should be up shortly, probably within a week or so. And with that, we'll wrap things up and look forward to more positive steps forward in this area across the entire gender equity spectrum with all of our partners and with Out to Innovate. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for tuning in.